Batman Begins movie review. So this is part of my scripted movie review series in which I go back through my archives and reread old movie reviews I've written. This one is from 2005, right when Batman Begins was out in theaters. It's interesting looking at this because my opinions have changed. I don't really agree with much of what I wrote here, maybe one or two points. But I guess why don't I read out what I had written first of all, and then maybe I'll nitpick myself and talk about where I got it wrong. So I'm responding to a post a friend had written, and I say, I agree with him when he says that comic book superheroes are like the mythology of America. So to a certain extent, we expect the movies to treat these superheroes as legends. We don't want Batman Begins to be just another action movie. We want to be able to immerse ourselves in the mythology of the character. I think the original Superman movie, this is the original 1978 movie, was able to do this in exactly the same way that Spider-Man didn't. This is the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man. The first two parts of the original Superman, it had serious third act problems, but we'll get to that later. The first two parts of the original Superman felt like a movie where the creators knew they were dealing with an American legend and treated it accordingly. The story didn't rush through the story of Superman's origins, and there was an incredible sense of drama about everything that was happening for the first time. Lex Luthor may not have been much of a villain. He didn't have his own superpowers or own origin story. But it didn't matter because it was Superman's story. And in fact, the simpler the villain was, the better, because it took less away from Superman's own story. The more complex villains could be introduced in the later films. The Spider-Man movie, by contrast, felt the need to cram Spider-Man's whole origin in the first half of the movie, combine it with the Green Goblin's origin, and then use the second half of the movie for the standard action sequences in the third act climax. There was nothing that really felt special about the Spider-Man movie. It was just like any other action movie. Given how recognized Spider-Man is as an American icon, the movie should have felt more special. We should have felt the drama of witnessing the birth of an American legend. By this criteria, I think the first half of Batman Begins is a success. It's not exactly the same feeling as a Superman movie, but then again, Batman is a different kind of superhero than Superman. Batman is a bit darker than Superman, and the movie gives us a good feeling of the dark, comic book mystique of Gotham City. The problems were largely with the villains, which is the same problem with the Spider-Man movie. I thought, in both movies, I thought there were too many villains, and their stories threatened to crowd out Batman's own story. After all, in the comic books, the superheroes don't take on the supervillains from day one. There's a learning curve. At first, they struggle to take on just the average bank robbers. Sorry. After they've established their identity, then some supervillain arch nemesis shows up. They spend a while fighting just average crooks before they are paired up against a supervillain. In the movies, this learning curve is always accelerated. Admittedly, Batman Begins is better in this regard than Spider-Man. The Scarecrow is regulated to a minor character, and the main villain is someone, like Batman, without any superpowers. And yet, it seemed to me a bit strained that Batman, straight off the block, was taking on a huge super organization filled with people who were much more experienced than he was, and winning. If I were making a superhero movie, I wouldn't have any major villains in the whole first installment. It would all be about the hero's own story. Of course, I know this would never work in Hollywood because everyone expects a dramatic climax and an all-out fight scene at the end between superhero and supervillain. Which brings me to my next point. Obviously, movies based on comic books do very well financially, which is why Hollywood keeps cranking them out. But for all the money they make, there are very few good comic book movies. This, I believe, is because of the inherent difficulties in transferring a story from one medium to another. For instance, in the world of comic books, Batman looks perfectly normal in the cartoon world. When the story is transferred to the big screen, you can't help but think to yourself how ridiculous it looks seeing a grown man in a bat suit jumping around and fighting criminals. But that's just a cosmetic issue. More problematic is that the very stories of the comic books themselves don't transfer well to the big screen. Although comics are violent, and there's usually a big action sequence, the action is almost secondary to the story. Comics often have ridiculous stories that, if they were produced in any other medium, we would just laugh at them. But somehow they seem to work within the realm of comic books. We forgive the ridiculous storylines because we become involved in the silliness of it all, and we want to see what will happen next month. Comic book stories do not work like a Hollywood movie, starting with an exposition, building to a conclusion, and then finishing off with the climax. Instead, each comic book is a continuation of the one before it. The story often does not really ever finish, but just evolves into another plot. And the ending of a comic book is not a climatic action sequence, but a cliffhanger until next month. Now, call me a purist if you want, but I get a little uneasy when I see a comic book adaptation starts working towards a Hollywood-style climax. During the final climactic battles on the train, spoilers for Batman Begins, I thought to myself, haven't I seen this a million times before in other movies like Speed or Triple X? The only difference is that this time, the hero is in a bat suit. And somehow, instead of adding to the story, that just makes it seem all the more silly. The whole comic book mystique seems lost. Of course, by this criterion, it is hard to find a comic book movie that works. After all, that is what movies do. They work towards a climax. Spider-Man 2 and X-Men 2 perhaps came closest because both movies had the sense of the same story that was continuing from the first movie and would continue in the third. But even these movies fit into the three-act structure. If Hollywood would decide to return to the serial matinee style of the 1940s, that would seem like the structure truly suited to handle the comic book. I won't hold my breath waiting for that to happen though. Okay, so that was something I wrote 13 years ago. Boy, I don't know what I was thinking. That whole complaining about, I don't agree with any of that anymore. I guess there are, I disagree with just about everything I said 13 years ago, except I do find with this whole Christopher Nolan Batman movies, and I know they did have their moments of brilliance, and the second movie in the trilogy was amazing. But in all of these movies, I did kind of think to myself, isn't it kind of strange? A grown man running around in a bat suit. Now I know that's in the comic books, but in the comic books, it seems to work because it's like a cartoon, or I don't know. You're so used to seeing these kind of brightly colored superheroes on the comics page that you just kind of accept it. Maybe when these things first came out in the 1940s, people thought they were ridiculous. But it's something we've all kind of grown up with on the comic book pages. But I don't know, I just couldn't get over it watching those Batman movies about, like, doesn't he look just silly, a grown man wearing a bat suit like that? Now maybe some of that's just me getting old, because you know the Tim Burton 1989 Batman, which I saw when I was 12 or something, I never really had a problem with that. The old Adam West Batman, I never had a problem with that. I think maybe I was just younger and these things didn't jump out at me. But yeah, I did feel like it was a little bit ridiculous, that scene on the train where Batman, is wearing the Batman suit. I've at this point now, I've watched all the Christopher Nolan Batman movies, and I guess I did get used to it a little bit. I don't know, maybe this is just me. It's probably just me, isn't it? I've probably just gotten old enough where I've got trouble suspending my disbelief anymore. Because when I was a kid, I didn't have any problem with the Tim Burton Batman movies. Yeah, the other thing is kind of thinking way back then it would be cool if the movies were kind of set up like the comic book world, where you'd have kind of a continuing story spread out across several movies. So that was what I was saying back in 2005 that I thought would be really cool way to adapt comic books, but that I don't think Hollywood would ever do it. And lo and behold, Marvel Studios has come along and they're doing this now. So I guess all I had to do was ask for it. But yeah, maybe they were reading that blog post back in 2005. Who knows?